I'm Rach from Mellow Yarns. Welcome to or welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to set out some of the things that you might want to think about when choosing yarn for your next crochet or knitting project. I know that when I was starting out, I made so many rookie mistakes when buying yarn, so I want to help you avoid some of these mistakes, especially if you're new to the world of crochet or knitting. I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of different fibre types, including what types of fibre are good for what types of projects. I'm going to explain what yarn weight means and how to convert from American to Australian yarn weight sizing. I'm going to set out some of the characteristics that you want to think about when choosing your yarn, what you might want to consider when it comes to colour, and finally how much yarn you're going to need for that project. So let's dive in. So the first and probably the most important decision you'll want to make when choosing a yarn is what fibre type. So I'm going to cover off some of the pros and cons of some of the most common fibre types you'll find here in Australia, as well as what kind of projects are good for what kinds of yarn. So starting with a very popular choice, wool. Now some people I find use the terms wool and yarn interchangeably, but not all yarn is wool. Wool has some lovely characteristics. It's a natural fibre, it's very warm, very breathable, so it makes it ideal for wearables, especially winter wearables like hats, scarves, jumpers, that kind of thing. It does have some drawbacks, however. It does tend to be expensive. Often it needs to be hand washed or at least washed on a cold cycle, but sometimes you might see yarn labelled as super wash wool. This wool has been treated to prevent felting in the wash, and so it is machine washable, unlike most wool. The other downside to wool is that it can be scratchy and a bit itchy. This is very much a personal thing. Some people love the feel of wool, some people find it a little irritating on the skin. One of the great things about being here in Australia is that merino wool is very commonly available, and merino is typically much softer and much nicer against the skin than other types of wool. Another great natural fibre option is cotton. This is a plant-based fibre. Cotton is very lightweight and breathable, so it is ideal for making summer wearables like beach cover-ups, t-shirts, summer hats, etc. But cotton also has quite good structure and stiffness to it, so it tends to hold its shape a little bit better than some other fibre types. This can be great for things like tote bags, hats, anything where you want the finished project to keep its shape. The other great thing about cotton is that it's absorbent, so it's good for things like dishcloths or reusable makeup wipes, basically anything where you want your final product to absorb water or get wet. The main drawback in my experience with cotton is that it's quite a stiff yarn. It doesn't have much stretch to it, and this can be an issue if you are brand new to crocheting and if your tension is a little bit tight, because it means it's just not that forgiving. If your stitches are tight, you'll find them hard to work into. Even for experienced crocheters, working with 100% cotton can be a little bit hard on the hands. The other downsides to cotton in my experience, sometimes it's not the softest of fibres. Cotton also can have a tendency to be a little bit splitty, and that means the yarn can have a tendency to split into its individual fibres, which can be a bit frustrating to work with. So next I'm going to talk a little bit about acrylic yarn. Now acrylics vary really significantly in their quality. Some of them are rough and scratchy, they feel plasticky, they squeak on your hook as you're working with them, but then some acrylics are billowy and soft and just lovely to work with. Some of the softest yarns that I've used have been acrylic yarns. So it can be a little bit hard to generalize about acrylics. So acrylic is a synthetic yarn made from plastic or plastic polymer, which means it's not a natural fibre and it's not biodegradable. Acrylic yarns tend to be cheaper. As I mentioned, some acrylic yarns are really soft and lovely to work with, but this does vary a lot by yarn brand and acrylic type. Typically, acrylics are very durable and often machine washable. There are some drawbacks to acrylics, so being non-biodegradable means that they do have a more significant environmental impact. Now this is something that I want to dive into in a little bit more detail, but I want to do my research and do that thoughtfully before I comment on it in much depth. So keep an eye out for a future video where I dive into some of the environmental and animal ethical implications of different yarn types. If this is something that concerns you, then there are quite a lot more recycled yarns out there these days, including recycled polyester, recycled acrylics. So I know that Line Brand, for example, has a recycled polyester yarn called Respun that's available at Spotlight. The other downsides of acrylics are that they are not breathable in the same way that natural fibres are, and acrylic yarn will not be as warm as a wool yarn. So most of the yarns that you'll find out there will probably actually be a blend, typically of acrylic and either cotton or wool. Blends can be great because often they'll give you the best of both worlds. For example, I really like this Brighton cotton blend yarn from Four Seasons. It's a blend of 50% cotton, 50% acrylic, and I prefer working with this than working with 100% 100% cotton yarn because it has all of the great characteristics of cotton. I use this yarn to make dishcloths and it makes the yarn lovely and absorbent, breathable, has really lovely drape to it, but because of the acrylic it's just a little bit easier to work with, a little bit nicer on the hands than 100% cotton. So a couple of less common but interesting fibre types include alpaca and bamboo. So I love alpaca yarn. It's very soft, it's very breathable, it's got a lot of the characteristics of wool, but it's a lot softer and nicer to the touch. Alpaca yarn tends to be a little bit fluffy. I love a fluffy yarn. I'm a complete sucker for a little bit of a fuzzy halo to my yarn, but unfortunately this does mean it's not the most beginner friendly yarn, because yarn that is too fluffy makes it hard to see your stitches, which can be hard when you're still learning the parts of your stitch and where to insert your hook. So this is an alpaca yarn. This is baby alpaca ear from Patterns, and it's a blend of 75% baby alpaca and 19% merino wool. Cashmere is another really lovely animal fibre made from goats, but it tends to be very expensive. Another fibre type that is becoming more common is bamboo. So this is Go Handmade Soft Bamboo, which is a blend of bamboo and cotton yarn that I got from Hobie a little while ago. Bamboo has a lot of similar characteristics to cotton. It's very lightweight, very breathable, so it's great for summer wearables. The main downsides to bamboo in my experience is it is a little bit shiny, which is great if you like that look, but I personally prefer my yarn to look a little bit matte, and it is a little bit slippery and splitty in my experience, so again it might not be the most beginner friendly fibre type. Okay, so once you've decided on the fibre type that you want, the next most important thing for you to think about is the yarn weight. Now, by weight I actually mean the thickness of the yarn, not how much it weighs. Here in Australia, yarn weight is typically described in terms of ply, usually ranging from about 4 ply up to around 12 ply for most yarns you'll see in the store. But in the US and actually most other countries, yarn weight is described using particular terms rather than ply. So I'll include a conversion guide in the description below for how to convert between US yarn weight terms into Australian, but the terms include things like DK or double knitting, which is an 8 ply yarn, sock weight, fingering weight, and bulky. So just to give you an idea how much yarn weight can vary, this is a lace weight yarn, this is a mohair, so very fine yarn, whereas this yarn is a super bulky yarn, which as you can see is just significantly thicker. So yarn weight matters for a few reasons. One is it will dictate what size crochet hook or knitting needle you need to use. So typically your yarn label will tell you what size knitting needle or crochet hook you need for that size yarn. But also yarn weight will dictate how quickly your project will work up and what the final dimensions will look like. Typically larger weight yarns like a super bulky yarn will produce a larger amount of fabric with a fewer number of stitches than a lighter weight yarn. So generally you want to stick with the size weight yarn that your pattern or project calls for. Sometimes I find you can go up or down 1 or 2 sizes, but anything more than that you're going to substantially change the dimensions of your finished product. If you're making amigurumi or crochet toys, typically you want to go down 1 hook size from the one that's listed on the label, just because that style of crochet looks best with tight stitches. If you're brand new to crochet or knitting, I would suggest trying to stick with medium weight yarns, at least initially. So very fine yarns will take a really long time to work up, which can be a bit demotivating if you're brand new. Really chunky yarns can actually be beginner friendly because they do work up really quickly, but I find very chunky yarns and very large hook sizes can be a little bit hard to grapple with. So typically I find 8 or 10 ply DK weight is about a good place to start if you are brand new. Then you want to choose your colour. So obviously colour is a personal preference thing. There are lots of great guides online for how to use colour theory to help choose the colour palette for your project. But a couple of things I did want to mention about colour. One is that if you are brand new, you'll want to avoid very dark yarns. So black, dark navy, that kind of colour. And that's because with these yarns, it's very hard to see the parts of your stitches and where to insert your hook. So you'll only want to use these yarns if you have been crocheting or knitting for a while and you have a feel for where your hook or needle needs to go. Some people also find this for white yarn, but I typically find that's a little bit easier to read than a really dark yarn. The other thing to know about colour is there's something called dye lots. So when yarn is dyed, it's dyed in batches, and those batches are listed on the yarn label of your yarn. And the reason that's important is because you want to buy all of the yarn you need for your project from the same dye lot. and that's because the colour of the yarn can vary between batches, even if it is technically the same colour. So ideally you want to get all of your yarn from the same dye lot for a given project. So if you look on your yarn label, you'll see something that's called lot or dye lot, and that will have a number. That is your dye lot, and ideally you'll want to match that between all of the skeins or balls of yarn that you're purchasing for your project. There are some horror stories online of people who have picked up yarn that is technically the same colour but from a different dye lot and ended up with a project where the colour changes quite substantially partway through. So there are a few other characteristics you might want to think about when choosing the yarn for your project. So one of those considerations is how fluffy your yarn is, or whether it's got halo. So halo just refers to the kind of fluff around the yarn fibre. Personally, I'm a sucker for a bit of fluff. I love a fluffy yarn, but unfortunately fluffy yarn is not the most beginner friendly for the same reason that you want to avoid dark coloured yarns. It's just really hard to see the parts of your stitch if the yarn is very fluffy. This is particularly true for chenille yarns, which is that kind of soft fuzzy yarn that is really popular for making crochet plushies. That kind of yarn is very hard to see your stitches, so it's not the most beginner friendly. Another consideration is springiness or stretch. So does the yarn have a little bit of stretch to it? Does it have give when you stretch it between your fingers? The reason you want to check that is that for some projects you actually want a really stiff yarn. If you're making a basket, something that needs to hold its shape, then typically you'll want a yarn that isn't too springy. But for wearables, you'll want something that has a bit of stretch to it. And as I mentioned earlier, if you are a beginner, you'll typically want yarn that is a little bit springy, a little bit stretchy, because it will be more forgiving to work with. Another thing to think about is splittiness. So yarn is typically made by weaving individual strands of yarn together. So you'll see this bamboo yarn here is made up of individual strings or fibres. So splittiness refers to the tendency of a given yarn to split into these individual fibres. Splitty yarn can be really frustrating to work with, especially if you're new, because it can make it hard to see where your yarn starts and ends, and it can be really easy to accidentally split the yarn with your crochet hook or knitting needles. So typically it's a good idea to see how tightly woven the yarn is when you're checking it out in the store. Or if you're really struggling with splitty yarn, you can also look for yarns that are made of a chain net construction. So this alpaca yarn is a chain net construction, so it's not actually individual fibres, it's almost like a plait of yarn, and this kind of yarn isn't going to split into its individual fibres, so it can be a good option if you are getting frustrated with splitty yarn. Another thing you can check out is whether the yarn is spun with an S twist or a Z twist. So this refers to the direction in which the individual fibres are spun, whether the direction of the spin is in line with the middle section of an S, so going from top left to bottom right, or if it is in the direction of a Z, so from top right to bottom left. Most yarns you'll find out there will have an S twist to them. S twist yarn is ideal if you're a right-handed knitter or if you're a left-handed crocheter, and that's because the way that you work the yarn will actually make the yarn fibres twist together even more, so they won't become unwound. However, if you are a right-handed crocheter or a left-handed knitter, then the way that you work will actually slightly untwist the yarn, which can lead to splittiness. So if you are a right-handed crocheter, you can try and see if you can find a yarn that has been twisted into a Z twist. You should find that this yarn type is less splitty. However, Z twist yarns are definitely much rarer than S twist yarns, so they can be hard to find. And this may seem like it's stating the obvious, but also the feel of the yarn is really important. I think it's really easy to underestimate just how much the feel of the yarn will contribute to how much you enjoy doing the project. You're going to be working with it for a long time, it's going to be drawing across your hands, and so if you don't like the feel of your yarn, you're probably not going to enjoy making the project. And then the final thing to take into account is quantity. How much yarn do you actually need to buy for your project? Now, in an ideal world, you'll already know what project you're making, you'll have a pattern, it will have told you exactly how much yarn you need. But sometimes, and I know that I am definitely guilty of this, you go into a yarn store, you find some beautiful yarn that you fall in love with, and you decide you need to buy it even though you don't have a project in mind for it just yet. If you are in this situation, I'll link in the description below a link to this guide from Lion Brand, which gives you an approximate amount of yarn that you'll need for different types of projects based on the yarn weight that you are buying. There are a few reasons why you do want to get quantity right. So one is the dye lot issue that I mentioned earlier. If you discover halfway through your project that you're going to need to buy more yarn, then it's going to be harder for you to find yarn from the matching dye lot. So it's much better to buy all of your yarn up front. But the other reason is just price. I think it's really easy to underestimate just how much yarn certain projects take, and you'll want to know whether you're going to need 3 hanks of that $42 hand-dyed merino yarn or 15 hanks before you commit to using that yarn for your project. So that's all for today's video. I really hope that you found it useful. I'd love to hear your tips and experiences for buying yarn down in the comments below. And in the meantime, happy crafting! Thanks so much for watching this video. I really hope that you found it useful. And if you made it to this point in the video, I'm so grateful. You are my people, and I am so glad that you found your way here. Also, if you're really wanting to master the art of crochet, be sure to check out my Learn How to Crochet kit in my YouTube storefront. So this kit is a little bit different from others that you'll find in the market. I've designed this kit more like a Learn How to Crochet masterclass in a box. And by that I mean that I've specifically designed the patterns so that they are ideal for beginners, cover all of the major stitches and techniques that you'll want to master when you're starting out. What this means is that by the end of the kit, you'll be able to tackle basically any beginner, advanced beginner, and even some intermediate crochet projects. So in this kit, you'll learn things like how to keep your edges straight, how to manage your tension, how to seam, and even how to do some color work. Each pattern builds on the skills that you learned in the previous pattern so that your confidence and your skill set will grow as you work through the kit. And by the end of the kit, you'll have some great little items that you can use around your house. The kit is also designed to teach you how to read a crochet pattern because I've included detailed long form written instructions alongside short form notation in the format that crochet patterns are typically written, along with detailed step-by-step tutorials. It also includes troubleshooting support and other handy tips and tricks. I've also designed the projects to expose you to different types of fibres, different styles of crochet, and different hook sizes, so you can start to learn what you really enjoy to crochet with. So make sure you go and check it out and let me know what you think. Thank you so much for crocheting with me today, and happy crafting!